When most people think of serial killers, and perhaps the most prolific of them all, they tend to bring up a plethora of names that have become infamous for their heinous crimes. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, or even Harold Shipman. The act of murder is not solely exclusive to just men, but it's statistically proven that serial killers are more likely to be male. However, what if I told you it may just be possible that the most prolific serial killer in history was an Italian woman who, over a period of almost 20 years, racked up around 600 victims? Today on Macabre Mini Mysteries, we uncover the story of Giulia Tofana, the makeup murderess. And welcome back to another episode of Macabre Mini Mysteries. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey into another macabre tale from around the world. Today we're going to be exploring the history and lore behind potentially the most deadly of serial killers of all time. However, before we get into today's story, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into some lesser known historic tales from London, and in fact all over the world, then please don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. And also, if you do like the show and you'd like to support what I make to make sure it continues, then why not consider becoming a patron, the link for which is in the description, so I can continue to regale you with the haunted history we both love. Also, we're coming up to the last few weeks of the first launch of the merch, so if you've had your eye on something, make sure you get it now, as I can't guarantee it will be there for much longer, and there'll be new designs coming soon. Today's story is something which on first hearing may sound unbelievable. By all means, I was incredibly sceptical when I first heard about it myself. As we all know, I pride myself in being able to provide as much credible research as possible and to explore a multitude of sources to put my stories together. So when I first heard about this tale, which was buried at the bottom of what I might be remembering wrongly here in a History Extra email bulletin, I had to know more. The piece in the email was only a paragraph, but once I read it, I added her straight to my list of episode topics. Then I put it off for about 2 years because, much like the History Extra or whoever it was that sent me that email, the story was scant and the details were barely there. However, luckily over the past few years, people have happily begun diving into this tale and finding out more about this legendary woman whose story and that of her victims were in danger of being lost to time. However, luckily for me, the wait has proved fruitful and there's lots of lovely sources to learn from. But much like any historical case, some of the elements may well have been embellished over time in favour of making it a better tale to tell. So there may be elements which have to be taken with a spoonful of salt. So I hope you don't mind your stories a little bit savoury. But having said that, even though some of the information about Giulia herself may have been embellished, the anthropology of the people involved and the social climate at the time is very much real. So let's start at the very beginning with the inciting incident for this tale. It's a scorching hot summer day on July the 12th, 1633 in Palermo, Italy. A crowd has gathered to watch the execution of a woman who is being convicted of poisoning her husband. A young girl in the crowd watches the whole sordid affair and sees her own mother put to death by being hanged, drawn and quartered for a crime there was no proof of. Giulia Tofana, in an instant, was orphaned as her mother had allegedly poisoned and murdered her father Francis, and now her own mother had been executed for this crime, bringing her world crashing down and inflicting incredibly long-lasting trauma, which would go on to shape the rest of her life. Tofania D'Amato was accused of murdering her abusive husband. At the tender age of 13, Giulia was left orphaned, forever scarred by the violence that tainted her childhood. But why would Tofania murder her husband in such a callous way? Allegedly, the abuse in the D'Amato household had got out of control, and she felt helpless, and with no one to turn to, she had had enough, and decided she would get rid of the man who was hurting her. Tofania had consulted with a friend of hers, Francesca Lasada, who just so happened to be skilled in herbalism, and she provided her with a tincture which could be placed without detection into food or drink, leading to an undetectable cause of death. Francesca was known locally as a cunning woman, a term which was reserved for those skilled in herbalism, providing tinctures, potions and lotions for all sorts of ailments and beautification purposes. Francesca, who was friends with Tofania, provided her services to create the Aqua Tofana, which was created especially on her request to off Francis. When the tincture worked well and had its desired effect, Francesca went on to continue selling this to other clients on the black market, but unfortunately her deadly business didn't go unnoticed, and a year later she too would also be executed for her creations. After Tofania was executed, Francesca took Giulia under her wing, and technically, as she had somewhat been responsible for the situation, she felt indebted to the child and apprenticed her in the skills of lotion and potion making. She also taught Giulia how to make Aqua Tofana, amongst other things, and as such, Giulia now had a trade she could take with her. It was up to Giulia if she went on to use the deadly side of her skill, but she was now equipped with a robust business plan. Once Francesca had been executed, Giulia fled Palermo as she figured it wouldn't be long before she too would also be under suspicion of creating these poisons, and so she moved on to Naples. Once settled in Naples, Giulia went on to get married. She had a daughter who she named Girolama Spara, but it wouldn't be long before she suffered another tragedy as her husband passed away. Now, there isn't much information as to why he passed away or if Giulia happened to be responsible, but sudden death was very common back in this period, as there was all sorts of illnesses that, without today's medical interventions such as antibiotics, could easily wipe you out in a matter of days. Now on her own and with a child to feed, Giulia had to come up with a plan of how to make ends meet, and so she turned to her skill as a cosmetologist. She moved to Rome, and throughout the town she quickly became known in the city for being a great beauty, and she shared that her secret happened to be of her own making. She was a skilled artisan who made her own makeup line, and her products quickly became the talk of the town. Becoming the Rihanna of her day, Giulia had her own workshop where she made and sold makeup. And just like anything Fenty Beauty has ever made, her products were flying out the door and she couldn't keep up with demand. Having a female-owned independent business back in Renaissance Italy was a big deal. Giulia was the original girl boss and she expanded her empire rapidly. Her studio would grow to eventually include around 200 workers, the majority of which were female, and she provided a lot of job opportunities for women who couldn't find work anywhere else. The Tofana beauty line specialised in a lot of standardised beauty products, but it also catered to some more out there tastes, and things which nowadays would melt Gwyneth Paltrow's vagina-scented candle. Alongside your standard creams, oils and lotions, Giulia also sold items which could be used in people's personal magical rituals, such as powdered menstrual blood and breast milk. The place of women in society in Italy during this time was very much the patriarchal typical archetype we all know from history. Women were property which belonged to men and treated as such. Arranged marriages were a thing, and men made all the decisions for anything that happened within women's lives. There was no bodily autonomy, and of course this led to a lot of very unhappy women, and the status quo was that they were second-class citizens for men to do with as they wished. Pair this with a sharp economic downturn in the 1600s, which saw many people struggling to survive, and the majority of people facing incredibly dire situations, and you have a recipe for calculated murder. Divorce wasn't an option in Italy, as it wouldn't become legal until 1970. Yes, you've only been able to legally divorce in Italy for just over 50 years. So of course, if you were in a horrendous relationship and faced regular domestic abuse, there was no way out. This led women to make drastic decisions to save their own lives. It was kill or be killed. Giulia herself empathised with what many of her customers were experiencing. After all, she could relate to the anguish of an abusive household, which resulted in her becoming an orphan. Of course, the apple never falls far from the tree, and so Giulia clearly inherited some of her mother's aptitude for murder, or at least she knew what it was like to see someone she loved suffer at the hands of the person who was meant to love them. Pair this with her predilection for creating products and the business practices she'd learned from her mother's friend and supplier Francesca, and a rehashed version of the makeup and murder trade she'd learned back in her hometown, Giulia was about to become the go-to woman for disposing of a nasty husband. The service Giulia was offering in Rome brought in a particular type of customer. As it was an exclusively all-female customer base, Giulia saw many women come in who wanted to cover their bruises and wounds that they had been ever so lovingly gifted to them by their pigs of husbands. She could offer a simple solution for a relatively low fee. Unlike the business she'd learned from Francesca, which was making high-end products, Giulia had affordable versions for the less wealthy, and being a working-class woman herself, she understood the value of creating a product line which was available for a range of budgets, as that way she made more money. But equally, she wanted to help the women that came to her business struggling with their home life. Giulia was a master of her craft. She somehow managed to forge her way into being allowed to observe the local chemists at work in their apothecaries and learned a lot about chemistry and the science behind powders, lotions, and most importantly, potions, so she could devise cheaper alternatives. Having genned up on her chemistry, Giulia set about creating an elixir that just so happened, when added to an unsuspecting husband's pasta sauce, would lead them to perish. The word began to spread on the underground femphone that Giulia was able to put an end to the misery so many women were living in, and her sales went through the roof, but so did the death toll of the men in Rome. However, in order to make sure the net was spread wide to avoid detection, Giulia set up a network to distribute her products which spanned over 550 miles, ranging all the way from where she lived in Rome all the way down to the island of Sicily. Suddenly, a wave of unknown sickness plagued many of the men ranging across this vast expanse of land, and physicians were dumbfounded at what caused it. However, Giulia's savvy business practices had made sure her crimes were spread far and wide, and as such, not easily related to each other, leaving her homicidal Avon network to go undetected. Of course, this was a time when people could and did just drop dead with no apparent reason, as the skill didn't exist to be able to diagnose a lot of conditions. This meant, luckily for Giulia, it was almost 200 years too early for her to be discovered by toxicology, as this wouldn't be invented until 1850, when it was first used successfully by Jean Stas, when he managed to isolate plant toxins from human tissue. Anyway, back to Giulia. By this time, her product line was expanding, and people genuinely loved her products, and she was making enough money that she didn't need to be offering the poison selling on the side. But she had her own axe to grind, and every time she sold her deadly Aqua Tofana to a paying customer, she satiated her own need for revenge. Her poison tinctures had now become so well made that she could offer them in a huge range of different products, in whatever consistency the consumer thought would work best for them to disguise their real ingredients. Giulia decided to capitalise on a particularly popular blemish oil that was already on the market at the time. And much like the explosion of rosemary hair oil on TikTok over this past year, she figured making another version of it would be a good way to disguise her questionable business practices, as it would replicate many of the oil containers many women already had in their households. However, to the untrained eye, no one would know that they could kill a man in just a few days with the right dosage. With the network growing and expanding to cover over half of Italy, Giulia's makeup business kept recruiting new people to the distribution network. Often women who had successfully used her products, ended up single somehow, nudge nudge wink wink, and had then been offered a job working for Giulia. It was a big criminal network of dark mysticism and magic, which was actually a big thing back in the Renaissance period. But despite there being a history of witchcraft and potion makers residing in the underbelly of Rome, Giulia was hiding in plain sight and still operating above board with a legitimate business above ground. But of course, even like today's big businesses, there was of course the shady side of the criminal underworld that could be taken advantage of. With the religious side of things being above ground, people had to find a way to get what they actually wanted and needed in different ways. For example, terminations of pregnancies were of course medically quite difficult to do, but by administering some herbal remedies like mugwort or pennyroyal and making it into a tea, the chances of having a natural miscarriage were increased somewhat. Priests were often the first to hear about problems at home, and as such, if they were tied into the network, Giulia would give them a backhander for the referral. She was basically running the very first origins of a pyramid scheme. Father Girolamo, a local priest in Rome, hooked Giulia up with not only customers, but also the poison she needed. She was smart enough to not purchase the ingredients for her more deadly concoctions herself, as that would become quite obvious quite quickly as to what she was up to, and so she enlisted the help of Father Girolamo to set this up. It just so happened that he handily had a brother who was an apothecary, and for the right price, everything was set in motion. Now, perhaps running the largest organised criminal operation in the whole of Italy, Giulia was a kingpin of the magical black market underworld, which, just imagine Nocturne Alley and you've got a rough idea of what it would have been like. Just as an aside, I'm always going to use Harry Potter terminology as I'm a millennial and therefore it's ingrained in my vernacular, but I'm not condoning J.K. Rowling. She can go to hell in a hot air balloon full of earwigs. Priests often also dabbled in the dark arts to make money on the side and would be able to sell on things like love potions, hooking people up with fortune tellers and diviners. So, what actually was Aqua Tofana and what did it contain to make it so deadly? The colourless and odourless concoction was said to be a blend of, amongst other things, arsenic and belladonna. These versatile ingredients were used in very small amounts in other makeup products already, so with just a little tweak of the dosage, death would soon occur, and if the deliveries of the poison were traced back to Giulia, she could simply say she was using it in her other products. Once someone had imbibed the poison, the effects were quite difficult to discern from a lot of other common ailments at the time. In particular, the poisons mirrored the effects of dysentery, something which was incredibly common back in the day. This meant that a simple stomach upset could and did end lives quite regularly, and as there was no toxicology, the deaths were ruled as such and no further investigation was carried out, and everyone got off scot-free. Of course, once a woman had obtained and used the poison, she would act in the requisite way at her husband's death, playing the grieving widow, when secretly she was jumping for joy in the privacy of her own home that the pig was dead. But of course this was a very risky business, and alongside the sale of any of Giulia's Aqua Tofana came a strong warning. If anyone so much as made a peep, they'd find themselves with not only the authorities to answer to, which would more than likely end in execution, but also the whole of the criminal magical underworld. And what with their tools of the trade being undetectable, the contract meant everyone kept the whole operation very hush-hush, as if you messed it up, you'd be dead either way, or double dead if you really got it wrong, and no one wants to die twice. Once is bad enough. To mitigate the probable likelihood of being caught, Giulia brought in a verification process for all new customers, and this meant that they had to have a friend who had already used the service. Only previous customers who had bought items from her under the counter offerings were able to recommend new customers to her, and so from the outside it appeared to your average Joe that it was still just a normal, albeit very popular cosmetics business to anyone who wasn't privy to its seedy underbelly. Of course, what with that many customers and that many dead men, there was bound to be something that would eventually crop up and begin to unravel the web she'd so carefully constructed. Up until this point, all of Giulia's customers had been able to see through their commitment to their murders, and no one had got cold feet. That was until one woman couldn't go through with her plan and revealed everything, landing Giulia up Crap Creek without a spatula. In 1650, a woman had obtained some of Giulia's Aqua Tofana with the intention of ending her husband's life, and she added the deadly drops to a nice fresh batch of soup. As the pair sat down to dinner and he began to take his first slurp, she snatched the bowl away from him. Of course, this made him very suspicious of what may have really been in the soup, and so he began to question her. When she began panicking, he began to beat her to get the truth out of her, and after some brutal coercion, she admitted that she'd poisoned the soup using the drops she'd got from Giulia's makeup brand. Of course, the husband went instantly to the authorities of the town, which would have more than likely been the mayor or someone high up in the church, and let them know of his wife's evil intentions to take his life. It didn't take long before the woman gave up Giulia's name as the real perpetrator to those in charge, and the investigations began to try and track down the network that operated behind the mystical murder mob. Giulia was immediately questioned and her home ransacked, looking for evidence of poison. But of course she was clever enough to leave no traces where she lived. However, the word had already begun to spread along the network and the town, and many people came to her defence. After all, many women had a lot to lose if they were found out to have used Giulia's services, and so the attack pack came out in force to help clear her name and to present a united front. The authorities made a mistake in not arresting Giulia instantly, perhaps down to the mounting pressure coming from those living in the town, and this meant she could make an escape. Overnight, she packed her and her daughter Gerolama up and dumped anything potentially incriminating, making an escape from the city. She travelled to a new town and settled there asking for protection from the church as she had been falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit, and without asking too many questions, they granted it to her. But now she was in a new place, and having left everything she had behind, she had to start again from scratch, but it wasn't long before she was back up to her old tricks. With a newly established residence in a town where no one knew her, Giulia was able to set up her whole murder makeup business again and started to establish a new network of those willing to deal in her deadly nightshade water. But this time, Giulia knew better than to make herself the name of the brand. She used the nunnery that was connected to the church she'd been given sanctuary at as a distribution network. Women would come and speak to the nuns and tell them how awful their husbands were, and they'd tell them that they had just a little something that would take care of that for them, and then Giulia would make her tinctures on demand. Of course, with a few people then dying off in this smaller town, the deceptive cosmetics were discovered quite quickly. But even before then, people had become suspicious of this beautiful new outsider, and those she'd so graciously helped turned on her, saying she was poisoning the water supply so they could get off scot-free for their own wrongdoings and deny all culpability. The authorities tracked Giulia down and removed her from the sanctuary of the church, threatening to ruin them in the process if they didn't hand her over, and so she was put under arrest. Giulia was tortured for days on end until she confessed to the hundreds of women she'd supplied with her acqua tofana, which resulted in hundreds of deaths across Italy. Over her whole career in deadly cosmetics, which spanned 18 years, it's estimated that Giulia murdered around 600 men with her concoctions. Does this make her the biggest serial killer of all time? Well, that very much depends on what your definition of a serial killer is. Let's take, for example, Harold Shipman, the GP who murdered anywhere between 215 to 250 victims, but was only ever convicted of a sample of 15 murders. He did also prescribe abnormal amounts of medicines, knowing full well they would kill his elderly patients, but he also did administer some lethal amounts of diamorphine directly. So I don't know what I'm getting at there really, but I just thought it was interesting that Giulia in some ways took a similar approach in that she didn't administer the poison herself, but she did create it. Technically, she was just selling the poison. What people did with it once it was out of her hands was up to them. After all, Giulia's practices weren't actually anything new. Poisons had been sold for hundreds of years before her. She was just inventive enough to create a distribution network, which I think personally was incredibly ingenious. So I preferred to think of it as manslaughter instead, as once the product was out of her hands, she effectively had no control over it. In her mind, she created and provided a helpful service to eradicate an element of society which was causing a problem. Was it the right thing to do? Probably not, but was the oppression and horrendous violence and misogyny her fellow women faced fair as well? No, it most definitely wasn't. I know 2 wrongs don't make a right, but it's hard to not sympathise with the plight she was fighting when there were no other options available than to live in misery. After the killer version of Kylie Cosmetics was uncovered, so began a witch hunt to track down those that had used Giulia's services. Now, this is where things get hazy, because the records seem to peter out at this point, or they become very confused. Some say she died of natural causes, leading many people to believe she got high on her own supply and ingested acqua tofana before the authorities had a chance to get their hands on her, and that's the version I would like to believe. Other reports say both Giulia and her daughter Girolama hanged together for their crimes in Rome's Campo di Fiori market square, and subsequently other customers were tracked down and also executed or banished. But there's nothing that confirms this, and surely an execution of this size would have somehow been recorded. Now, for the most far-fetched theory, some say that due to her mystical powers, Giulia managed to evade capture and lived to be well into her hundreds. Let's hope this is true, but I highly doubt it. Of course, being a man, Father Girolamo, however, was said to get away with his involvement in the crime ring altogether and was protected due to being a man of the cloth. After all of the horrendous harm acqua tofana had done around Italy, it soon became somewhat of a status symbol and a sign of power. Those that could afford it wielded the power of tofana over others as a threat, and some say the concoction is still available to buy nowadays if you know the right places to look. Don't look at me, I don't know, but what I do know is that it's definitely not a super drug. They're out of stock at the moment, they said it's down to Brexit. Should be back in stock before the month is out. All jokes aside, acqua tofana went on to be used for a long time after Giulia's death. Mozart even said on his deathbed that he had been poisoned by acqua tofana. However, experts have concluded in recent years that his cause of death may have been more run-of-the-mill and more likely a bad case of strep throat. Of course, another theory is that Giulia was not the norm for the time. She was a woman with a business that was so popular that it spanned almost the whole of Italy, and people may have well been threatened by its popularity, so malicious lies were spread about her to take down her business, using her mother as an example of what she may be capable of. The truth in all reality is more than likely that the story we have for Giulia today is a combination of all of these tales, but also somewhat constructed to generate a cautionary tale to remind people that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. However, what we have to remember is that even though the tale has become a historical legend, it won't stop it from being a macabre mini mystery. Thanks for joining me for this episode. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts on this one. It's a complex tale, and so I'd love to get your take on it. And whilst you're at it, let me know which macabre mini mystery you'd like me to cover next. If you could please leave me a sacrificial comment for the algorithm gods, I'd really appreciate that, and a thumbs up on YouTube or a rating and review on your podcast provider. It helps more than you'd know. Also, if you're new around here and you like that story and you're not yet subscribed, then what are you doing? Come and join the Ghoul Gang. There's literally hundreds of episodes for you to catch up on. If you do like the show and you've been around for a while now and you'd like to support what I make and get your hands on a ton of bonus content, including extra episodes, then why not consider becoming a patron like these amazing top-tier legendary executive Patreon producers: Amy, Christina, Christophe, Jess, Kate, Kevin, Mary, Rose, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Teresa, Terri, V and Veronica, and all of our other patrons too. You can also check out the support me section in the notes for links if you'd rather just give a one-off tip. All support is 100% vital for me being able to continue this silly little show, and you don't even know how much it means to me. Thanks for even considering supporting me, and don't forget to head to the merch link in the description too to get your goodies before some of the designs are gone forever. That's macabrelondon-shop.fourthwall.com. And also, if you sign up to Patreon on the £5 and up tiers, you get a nice fat discount on merch too, which definitely makes it worth your while. And you get access to all the lovely bonus content too. Thanks for joining me for another macabre mini mystery. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you marvellous mystical murder mob next time. Maybe I'll put that on a t-shirt.